Alright everyone, tonight we're taking a slow, curious walk through the darker backstreets of medieval myth. Before you settle in, feel free to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy the stories we explore here. And drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from and what time it is for you. I always love seeing how far these stories travel. So dim the lights, maybe switch on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. If your image of Vikings is limited to towering blonde men smashing everything in sight with axes while yelling like they just stubbed a toe on Valhalla itself, congratulations. You've already met the berserkers. These warriors were the original rage machines of the medieval world. According to Norse sagas, they entered trance-like states during battle, becoming immune to pain, fear, and any concept of subtlety. For centuries, historians dismissed berserkers as poetic exaggeration. After all, ancient texts have a habit of getting carried away. Dragons? Sure. Magic swords? Obviously. Men turning into bears mid-fight? Probably metaphorical, right? Well, not entirely. Recent archaeological discoveries and modern scholarship have started connecting some very strange dots. Let's start with fashion. Several Viking graves contain animal pelts, especially bear and wolf, buried alongside warriors. Coincidence? Maybe. Or maybe cosplay just peaked 1,000 years early. Then things get even stranger. Enter the mushrooms. Specifically Amanita muscaria, the red and white spotted fungi you've seen in fairy tales and video games. This mushroom isn't just decorative. It's psychoactive. And yes, it grows naturally in parts of Scandinavia. Consuming it doesn't just make colors pop. It can cause euphoria, dissociation, intense sweating, shaking, and an overwhelming urge to fight something, possibly your neighbor's goat. Combine that with fasting, chanting, and pre-battle rituals, and you end up with a chemically enhanced human tornado swinging a battle axe. Imagine showing up to raid a monastery and being greeted by a half-naked man in a bear pelt, foaming at the mouth and sprinting straight at you. Contemporary accounts from enemies of the Vikings describe madmen, immune to wounds and utterly fearless. Some scholars even suggest they bit into shields, not for defense, but to control their convulsions. You know, normal Saturday night things. The term berserk now lives on in our vocabulary, but back then it was a terrifying tactical advantage. Imagine trying to form a disciplined shield wall while a hallucinogenic Norseman in a bear pelt sprints at you like he's in a heavy metal music video. Strategy meet chaos. Ah yes, 1518. The year when hundreds of people in Strasbourg, France decided to fight despair, famine, and disease. The only way they knew how, by dancing. Not metaphorically, not romantically, literally dancing until their feet bled, their hearts gave out, and the local authorities considered whether banning music might be healthier than banning witches. At first, it started small. One woman, Frafa, stepped into the street and began dancing. No music, no audience, just pure medieval groove. A couple hours in, and you'd expect someone to throw her a loaf of bread and suggest a nap. Instead, people watched. Then they joined, because apparently in 1518, seeing someone dance themselves into delirium meant, hey, looks fun, I'm in. Within days, dozens were dancing, then hundreds, and not at a festival in the middle of the street in the sweltering summer heat without food, water, or any sense of self-preservation. It would have made a great TikTok trend, minus the mass casualties. What's baffling is the response from city leaders. Instead of, say, quarantining the dancers or bringing in doctors, they leaned into it. Literally, they hired musicians, built a stage, encouraged the dancers to get it out of their system. That's right. Their cure for compulsive death dancing was to crank up the medieval bass. As you can imagine, that didn't work. Historians were long divided on whether this was real or just another pious parable from a time when leeches were considered medicine and astrology made career choices. But numerous records, city accounts, church logs, personal letters, all confirm the same terrifying footnote. People danced involuntarily, and some didn't survive. So what caused it? The top theories are 1. Ergot poisoning, a hallucinogenic mold that grows on rye and can cause convulsions, visions, and extremely poor life choices. Or 2. Mass psychogenic illness. Basically, Collective madness sparked by stress, fear, and a lack of hobbies. Whatever it was, it turned one city into a grim disco for a month straight. And if there's a moral here, it's this. Medieval Europe didn't always burn witches. Sometimes it threw them a dance party. If there's one thing the medieval period excelled at, it was turning optimism into tragedy with breathtaking efficiency. Case in point, the Children's Crusade of 1212, a campaign that sounds like a Disney sequel, but plays out more like a dark satire of human judgment. The legend goes something like this. A young shepherd boy in France, let's call him Stephen because that was literally his name, claimed he received a divine message from Jesus. Not just any message, mind you, but one that instructed him to lead a peaceful army of children to the Holy Land, not with swords, but with innocence, which, as it turns out, is not a useful weapon against trained soldiers in sea storms. Thousands of children joined, because why wouldn't you follow a teenage shepherd who said God told him to walk across Europe barefoot? Parents wept, townspeople cheered, bishops blinked slowly, and off they went across mountains, down rivers, through towns, singing hymns, starving slightly, getting arrested occasionally. It was a medieval school field trip minus the chaperones, and with significantly more divine hallucinations. The myth was long believed to be, well, a myth. Something exaggerated in monkish writings to teach a moral lesson. Don't send your kids to Jerusalem without adult supervision. But over time, historians began to uncover a trail of documents. Church records, royal decrees, city archives, all hinting that yes, something did happen, and it involved a lot of very young, very idealistic feet. What happened to them? Well, depending on which version you read, the outcome ranges from tragic to, oh God, why? Some were turned away at the Alps. Some likely died on the march. Others were tricked by unscrupulous merchants, loaded onto ships, and sold into slavery in North Africa. Not exactly the holy liberation they were promised. The Mediterranean wasn't so much parted for them as it was monetized. Today, scholars believe the movement wasn't entirely made of children. Many were likely teenagers or poor peasants labeled as puri, the Latin word for both children and servants, because of course it was. But the mass delusion, the sincerity, the epic miscalculation, that part's real. Picture this. It's a quiet day in 14th century France. A pig escapes its pen, bites a child, and the villagers don't just butcher it or blame the nearest peasant. No, they drag the pig to court with a lawyer and a judge and a public trial. Because in medieval Europe, justice wasn't just blind. It was extremely imaginative. Yes, animals were actually put on trial. Not metaphorically, not symbolically, literally. They were assigned defense attorneys, sometimes imprisoned, occasionally excommunicated. Nothing says rule of law like banishing a rooster from the church for laying an egg, which by the way they believed was laid by the devil himself. Because obviously for centuries people thought these stories were just exaggerated folklore. Surely medieval scribes were just being poetic, adding a little flair to their otherwise monotonous lists of grain taxes and fish quotas. But no court records. Actual parchment-bound proceedings have been found all over Europe. One famous case from 1386 involved Essay in Falais, France. She was found guilty of killing a child and was sentenced to death. She was dressed in human clothing, paraded through town, and publicly hanged because symbolism, retribution, general medieval weirdness. Even insects weren't safe. In 1510, a group of French peasants sued a horde of weevils for destroying their crops. The court appointed a lawyer to represent the insects, presumably someone who had annoyed the judge recently. After several hearings, the case was dismissed because, well, the bugs didn't show up. Classic defendant behavior. But here's the twist. This wasn't random insanity. To medieval minds, justice applied to the entire creation. Animals, though lower than humans, were still part of God's moral universe. If they committed a crime or were suspected of being in league with dark forces, they faced the consequences. The Middle Ages didn't do things halfway. Some of these trials were ecclesiastical, meaning the church got involved. Others were secular with full legal proceedings. All of them are now prime examples of how deeply humans can anthropomorphize anything with legs and a bad attitude. Nothing says medieval torture quite like the Iron Maiden. That infamous human-shaped metal sarcophagus lined with spikes on the inside, designed to turn heretics into Swiss cheese. You've seen it in museums, horror films, and probably that one guy's edgy high school sketchbook. There's just one problem. It's a complete historical fraud. Yes, the Iron Maiden is one of the most iconic torture devices never actually used in the Middle Ages, and yet it's paraded around as if it were the go-to tool of every moody inquisitor with a flair for the theatrical. Truth is, medieval torturers were creative, disturbingly so. But this particular device was a 19th century invention because apparently the Industrial Revolution wasn't horrifying enough on its own. So where did it come from? The first known Iron Maiden was cobbled together in the late 1700s or early 1800s in Germany, likely by someone who thought, you know what? This museum needs a big spiky lie. The idea was to create a compelling and horrifying display of what medieval justice might have looked like if everyone back then had watched too many slasher films. It was a hit. People loved the spectacle because nothing sells quite like a morbid mix of pseudo-history and bloodthirsty imagination. Even museums leaned into it. You can still find Iron Maidens proudly displayed behind glass with placards that quietly mention, actually, this is a Victorian-era replica of something we made up entirely. Of course, medieval people did use torture extensively, creatively, and with almost no HR department oversight. There were racks, thumb screws, heretics' forks, and something called the pear of anguish, which sounds like a fruit, but isn't. But the Iron Maiden, not on the list. They were too busy being horrible in more practical ways. Why do the myths stick? Because it feels true. It fits the narrative of a brutal, superstitious age. It's also visually terrifying, a perfect icon for our collective nightmares about the past. And so, a fake torture box became a real symbol of medieval cruelty. Let's clear up one of the most persistent myths about the Middle Ages. No, medieval Europeans did not think the earth was flat. They weren't that kind of clueless. They had other issues. Plague, famine, surprise invasions by relatives with swords. But basic planetary geometry wasn't one of them. In fact, most educated people in the Middle Ages knew the Earth was a sphere. Monks, scholars, and sailors understood it. Heck, even school books from the 1200s explained the Earth's roundness, usually while subtly threatening children with eternal damnation if they didn't memorize Latin conjugations. The myth of a flat Earth believing Middle Ages was actually cooked up much later in the 19th century, when historians wanted to make the Renaissance and Enlightenment look cooler by comparison. It's easier to feel superior when you imagine your ancestors navigating with maps that resembled pizza boxes. The real medieval cosmology came from thinkers like Isidore of Seville, Bede the Venerable, and Thomas Aquinas. People with very pointy handwriting and extremely strong opinions on theology, philosophy, and celestial spheres. They weren't always right, mind you, but they definitely weren't flat earthers. Many based their understanding on Aristotle and Ptolemy, who again were all aboard the spherical Earth train. There were even practical reasons for knowing the Earth was round. Ships disappearing over the horizon. Round Earth. The curved shadow on the moon during a lunar eclipse. Round Earth. The fact that people in Spain couldn't see the same stars as people in Egypt. Again, round Earth. Medieval logic may have been 30% divine revelation, 20% Latin mumbling, and 50% random guesswork, but they still got this one right. The confusion mainly comes from a few scattered quotes taken wildly out of context and a whole lot of 19th century revisionism. Washington Irving, yes, the Sleepy Hollow guy, wrote a wildly popular fictionalized biography of Columbus that exaggerated how radical his round Earth voyage seemed. Spoiler alert, it wasn't. Imagine being accused of theft in a medieval village. No fingerprints, no camera footage. No, you won't believe what they did. Town crier drama. Just you, a priest, a crowd of nosy neighbors, and a cauldron of boiling water. Because in the Middle Ages, justice often meant trial by ordeal, a legal process that relied less on evidence and more on divine intervention and third-degree burns. There were several popular orals, all of them designed to make you question your life choices. The ordeal of hot iron required the accused to carry a red-hot bar of iron for a few paces. If your hand healed cleanly in a few days, God clearly liked you. If it didn't, well, sorry, sinner. The ordeal of boiling water was even more fun. You'd plunge your hand into a pot of boiling water to retrieve a stone. Again, healing nicely, innocent, healing like a pizza left under a heat lamp. Guilty. And then there was the ordeal of cold water, which sounds more pleasant, but wasn't. The accused was tied up and thrown into a river. If they floated, they were guilty because water being pure would reject them. If they sank, well, innocent, but also dead. The system had its flaws. Now, modern minds might assume this was just barbaric nonsense. And yes, a strong argument can be made. But oddly, trial by ordeal sometimes worked. Not because of miracles, but because of psychology. Many people who knew they were guilty refused to go through with it, confessed beforehand, or settled matters another way. And the priests, oh, they often quietly rigged the results. Let the cauldron cool a bit. Use mild water. Judge the healing with some flexibility. They weren't sadists most of the time, just bureaucrats with robes. Eventually, trial by ordeal was banned by the church in 1215. Apparently, someone finally realized that burning people to prove their innocence might not be the pinnacle of divine wisdom. From then on, Europe slowly pivoted toward more rational legal systems. You know, like jewels, witch hunting, and accusing your neighbor of consorting with frogs. Ah, Robin Hood, the green-clad outlaw with the sharp arrows, sharper cheekbones, and an unshakable moral compass. Stealing from the rich, giving to the poor, and somehow keeping his tunic wrinkle-free while living in a forest. Sounds great, doesn't it? Almost too great. That's because the Robin Hood we know, the dashing rebel hero who spouts one-liners while dodging arrows in slow motion, is about 90% literary invention and 10% actual medieval tax drama. But here's the fun part. Someone like Robin Hood probably did exist, or rather several someones. Records from the 13th and 14th centuries mention men with suspiciously hoodish names, Robhod, Hobahod, and variations like robbers hoodoos, often listed as criminals or fugitives. And by criminals, we mean people who may have just skipped out on taxes, poached a deer, or looked at the local sheriff funny. None of them robbed banks or hosted socialist banquets under oak trees. But they were outlaws in the literal sense, cast outside the law, surviving on wit, bows, and a deep mistrust of authority. Over time, their stories merged into a composite legend like a medieval version of fanfiction. If that fanfiction also involved lots of stabbing and plague, the earliest ballads about Robin Hood aren't exactly Disney-friendly, either. In the 14th century versions, Robin is violent, short-tempered, and disturbingly fond of murdering monks. Maid Marian doesn't even make an appearance until later. In Friar Tuck, he'd sooner throw you in a pond than listen to your sins. Still, the legend evolved. By the time of the Tudor, Robin Hood had morphed into a cheerful rogue with a heart of gold and suspiciously modern values about wealth redistribution. Because nothing says medieval England like 16th century political spin. Was there a real Robin Hood? Probably not one single person. But the conditions that birthed the myth, corrupt officials, hungry peasants, and forests just begging for cinematic lighting, were very real. When you hear Black Knight, you probably picture some brooding guy in dented armor, sulking in the shadows, monologuing about vengeance while lightning cracks behind him. Basically a medieval Batman with worse dental hygiene. But in actual medieval history, the Black Knight wasn't a cackling villain or an edgy character from Monty Python's sketch. It was a real title, or at least a nickname with some surprisingly respectable roots. Black Knight usually referred to knights who either wore black armor, had a black coat of arms, or were associated with a noble family's dark cold livery. That's it. No necromancy, no soul harvesting, no dramatic declarations like, "You shall not pass." In fact, many Black Knights were just regular nobles trying to coordinate their outfits. One of the most famous was Edward of Woodstock, known as the Black Prince. He was a 14th century English prince and military commander, beloved by some, feared by others, and not at all the kind of guy who'd sit around in a cursed tower. He likely earned the nickname posthumously, maybe due to his black armor, or maybe because of his enthusiasm for burning French towns. Historians are still debating, mostly in polite academic jewels. It wasn't until centuries later that the term Black Knight started accumulating villain points. Romantic literature, 19th century novels, and early Hollywood gave the term a glow up, or more accurately, a gloom down. Suddenly, The Black Knight became the brooding loner, lurking on the fringes of tournaments, morally ambiguous and often shirtless for some reason. But back in the real Middle Ages, Black Knights were just part of the color-coded feudal fashion scene. They didn't swear dark oaths under blood moons. They just wanted their armor to match their family banners, and maybe look cool while doing it. Some medieval stories sound like they were written after a few too many pints of me. Take, for example, the tale of a shining city built in the middle of swamp by monks, a sort of holy Venice, but with more prayer and less gondolas. For centuries, local folklore in the English Fenland spoke of Crowland Abbey, a marvel of stone and piety, standing proudly on an island of dry land surrounded by boggy despair. It was said that monks built bridges out of faith, logs, and possibly divine stubbornness. Scholars long dismissed it as a quaint exaggeration. After all, who in their right medieval mind would build a monastery in a swamp? Well, monks would. Recent excavations have confirmed that Crowland Abbey, founded in the 8th century and expanded throughout the Middle Ages, did indeed rise out of the muck, complete with causeways, raised walkways, and early drainage systems so clever they make modern plumbing blush. These monks weren't just praying in the mist, they were engineering their way through it. They constructed wooden platforms on piles driven deep into the peat. They used gravel and clay to firm up walkways. And they built bridges, including the famous triangular bridge, which still survives today. Three-way symmetry, baby. You don't get that kind of architectural ambition from drunken peasants with a shovel. So why the swamp? Well, 2 reasons. Isolation and tax breaks. Monasteries were supposed to be separate from a sinful world. Nothing says holy isolation like being surrounded by mosquitoes, the size of pigeons. Plus, land no one else wanted was often cheaper. So monks got crafty. They turned the marshes into a hub of spiritual and economic activity, farming eels, making cheese, and somehow not getting trench foot every winter. The result? A real-life miracle of persistence, engineering, and mild dampness. One that confirms that even the strangest-sounding medieval legends might be hiding a soggy little nugget of truth. Ah yes, Pope Joan, the mysterious woman who supposedly fooled the entire Catholic Church, rose through the ecclesiastical ranks, became pope, and then dramatically gave birth in the middle of a papal procession. You know, your standard medieval Tuesday. For centuries, her story was whispered with scandalous glee and then furiously denied by church scribes with the energy of someone deleting browser history. Many modern historians declared it medieval gossip, a cautionary tale cooked up by monks who really didn't want women near the altar. But here's the thing. Recent reevaluations of medieval texts, art, and papal timelines have made some historians raise an eyebrow, and not in the sarcastic way. The earliest detailed versions of Joan's story appear in 13th century chronicles, but there are earlier hints. For example, the 11th century chronicle of Mariana Scotus lists an unnamed pope between Leo IV and Benedict III, a suspicious gap where Pope Joan supposedly reigned. Coincidence, or just a medieval clerical error? Pun, unavoidable. Then there's the odd tradition of the City of Stercaria, a throne with a suspiciously hollowed-out seat used during papal enthronements. Some believe it was designed to check that the new pope had the appropriate holy plumbing. Historians dismiss this as symbolic tradition, but really, if your throne has a built-in gender inspection feature, maybe you're protesting too much. Art complicates things further. Some medieval tarot decks and church murals feature a female pope figure. Was it Joan, or just the Middle Ages being weird again with symbolism? Hard to say. Medieval art wasn't exactly subtle. It's the same genre that put dragons next to saints and occasionally drew horses with human feet. So what do we make of Joan? A real figure erased from history? A medieval urban legend? A proto-feminist fever dream? The answer may lie somewhere in between. While there's no definitive proof she existed, there's also no smoking papal decree that debunks her. Just a lot of very anxious looking church historians from the 14th century onward who seemed desperate to change the subject. And if she did exist, she pulled off the greatest medieval disguise ever and had the worst gender reveal party in history. The myth goes like this. The reason Friday the 13th is considered unlucky has nothing to do with spilled salt or broken mirrors. It all goes back to the dramatic downfall of the Knights Templar. And unlike most scary campfire tales, this one actually has a historical backbone and a sword and a very angry French king. Let's rewind to October 13th, 1307. A Friday, naturally, when King Philip IV of France decided he was done being broke and slightly jealous of a secretive military religious order that had more land, more money, and frankly, better capes than he did. With the subtlety of a toddler flipping a board game, Philip ordered the mass arrest of the Knights Templar. Across France, hundreds were seized, tortured, and accused of crimes that range from spitting on the cross to worshipping a mysterious bearded head, which, if you've ever seen medieval relics, is honestly not that weird. The Pope at the time, Clement V, tried to act surprised, but eventually folded under pressure. And by pressure, we mean Philip breathing heavily down his neck with an army. The church disbanded the order in 1312, and the last Grand Master, Jacques de Molay, was burned at the stake in 1314. Before his fiery exit, he allegedly cursed both the king and the pope. And guess what? They both died within a year. Coincidence or medieval karma? So yes, the connection between Friday the 13th and the Templars has historical roots, though the superstition didn't really bloom until centuries later. But the drama, that's 100% certified medieval. The Templars weren't just knights. They were bankers, crusaders, landowners, and walking PR nightmares for secular rulers. Their downfall wasn't caused by heresy. It was caused by debt. King Philip owed them a lot of money, and nothing clears a tab like a few strategic executions and a smear campaign. When you think of medieval surgery, chances are you picture a bearded man with questionable hygiene soaring off limbs with a kitchen knife while screaming, "God wills it," over a background chorus of patient agony and Gregorian chants. And honestly, that happened more than once. But here's the twist. Not all medieval medicine was utter madness. Some of it actually worked. No, seriously. Recent analysis of 10th to 14th century medical manuals and archaeological remains shows that medieval surgeons weren't complete sadists with a hacksaw and a prayer. In fact, they were surprisingly competent at wound care, trepanation, and even cataract surgery with tools that looked like they were designed by a blacksmith on a budget. Take trepanation, the act of drilling a hole in your skull to relieve pressure, cure headaches, or release those pesky demons. Because why trust Tylenol when you can ventilate your brain? Archaeological evidence shows patients survive these procedures at decent rates, their skulls showing signs of healing. So not just a medieval lobotomy, more like a last-ditch effort with a decent follow-through. And then there's wound care. Texts like the Trot and Curia Magna contain recipes that would make a modern herbalist weep with joy. Honey, an antiseptic, wine, a disinfectant, and linen bandages were all used. Not quite penicillin, but honestly better than the rub, mud, and hope approach often credited to the era. Even dental work wasn't all pliers and screaming. Some surgeons used gold wire to secure loose teeth. Granted, medieval toothpaste was mostly charcoal and regret, but hey, they tried. Yes, there were leeches and urine analysis. And yes, if you had a suspicious mole, someone might call a sign of witchcraft and light you on fire. But overall, if you avoided the plague, war injuries, and humor imbalances, you had a fighting chance with a halfway decent barber surgeon. Of course, this doesn't mean medieval hospitals were soothing wellness spas. They were more like chaotic monasteries with a prayer budget, a bone saw, and a lot of yelling. But the myth that all medieval medicine was blind guesswork isn't entirely fair. Sometimes medieval doctors knew what they were doing. Other times they were just winging it with holy water and optimism. But credit where it's due, some of those patients actually walked out with all their limbs still attached. Let's bust one of the most stubborn medieval myths. The idea that everyone from the 5th to the 15th century wandered around like stinky, unwashed potatoes wrapped in wool. Contrary to this very pungent stereotype, many medieval people were not only aware of personal hygiene, they were downright fussy about it. Archaeological digs and manuscript evidence suggest that bathing, grooming, and scented oils were not only common, but part of a decent person's weekly routine. Now, did they shower twice a day and exfoliate with apricot scrubs? Absolutely not. But they did use soaps made from animal fat and ashes, and earthy tones, and many households had wooden tubs they filled with hot water for a nice soak, assuming you had a servant to haul it in and you didn't live in a drafty shack. And don't even get started on the public bathhouse, especially in places like medieval Paris, London, and the Islamic caliphates where shared steamy bathing was both a social activity and a way to not smell like old cheese. Some even had separate rooms for men and women. And yes, it sometimes got a little too social, which is why a few church leaders started side-eyeing the whole bathhouse industry. But hygiene wasn't just about water and soap. People trimmed their nails, cleaned their ears, and plucked their armpit hair with terrifying enthusiasm. Monks had strict grooming rituals. Nobles had perfumed gloves and tooth powders made from burnt rosemary and crushed shells, which probably didn't whiten your teeth, but at least it smelled like you tried. So, how the everyone was dirty and smelled like fermented onions myth begin? It likely stems from post-medieval bias, especially from the Renaissance and Enlightenment eras, where writers loved dunking on the Dark Ages to make themselves feel more, well, enlightened. Add in a few 19th century illustrators who never met a dirty peasant trope they didn't love, and voila, stinky medieval meme unlocked. To be fair, if you were a serf working 14 hours in a dung fill, you probably didn't end the day smelling like lavender and ambition. But the blanket assumption that no one in the Middle Ages knew how to wash their armpits officially debunked. So yes, medieval people bathed. Not daily, not always alone, but bathed nonetheless. No, this isn't a deleted Monty Python sketch. In certain parts of medieval Europe, people accused of crimes were subjected to something called the trial by consecrated bread or ordeal of the morsel. For those of you with a flair for ominous baked goods, here's how it worked. An accused person, usually a clergyman, will be brought in front of a jury of solemn, probably half-asleep monks. They'd then be handed a small piece of holy bread. Yes, blessed God-approved bread, and asked to chew and swallow it. Sounds simple, right? Like communion with steaks. The twist: if the accused choked, gagged, or looked generally nervous while eating the bread, boom. Guilty. Not just you seem suspicious. Guilty. We're talking God himself is now involved, and he clearly thinks you're shady. Guilty. This method was based on the belief that divine power would physically stop a liar from swallowing the body of Christ. Apparently, celestial justice had a direct line to your esophagus. It was essentially a medieval lie detector test, but instead of wires and sweat glands, you got carbs and judgmental monks. And you thought job interviews were stressful. What's wild is that this wasn't fringe behavior. These orals were sanctioned by church authorities for centuries, especially in Anglo-Saxon England. It was believed that divine intervention would reveal the truth where mortal justice failed. And because nothing says fair trial like giving a dry cracker to a terrified man and hoping he doesn't have acid reflux. Eventually, even the church realized this was getting a little silly. In the early 13th century, Pope Innocent III, who sounds like he should have been innocent, but really wasn't, banned clergy from participating in orals altogether. That basically shut the whole operation down. No monks, no magic bread. But the fact that this happened at all, totally real. It wasn't metaphor. It wasn't satire. It was bureaucracy baked. The initiation of a new Templar did not begin with fanfare or public ceremony. It began in silence in the earliest hours of the morning when the world still lingered in darkness. A candidate, usually a young knight of noble birth, would approach the gates of a Templar precept, a fortress monastery that was part barracks, part holy sanctuary. He arrived with no fanfare, no escort, and no weapons. By custom, he was to come humbly, leaving behind the trappings of his old life. His sword, his shield, his armor, and even his family's name would mean little inside those walls. To join the order was to sever ties with earthly glory. The gatekeeper admitted him into a courtyard still shadowed by a torchlight. The air was thick with a strange mix of anticipation and dread. Here silence was enforced. He was forbidden to speak until spoken to. Brothers of the temple guided him into the chapel, the heart of the ritual. Unlike the grand cathedrals of Christendom, a Templar chapel was often stark and bare. Flickering lamps threw long shadows across stone walls, while relics, splinters of the true cross, bones of saints, and holy icons were arranged upon the altar. The setting was designed to impress upon the initiate that he was stepping into a realm where the sacred outweighed the worldly. The brothers assembled in solemn ranks, their white mantles marked with the blood-red cross. The candidate stood alone before them, a solitary figure beneath their watchful gaze. Every movement was deliberate, every moment choreographed to remind him that he was no longer an individual, but a servant of a larger divine cause. Even the air seemed heavy, filled with an unspoken question. Was he truly ready to abandon everything? The dawn light began to creep through narrow slits in the chapel walls, illuminating the altar as the candidate was led forward. His journey had begun not with battle, but with surrender. Before him lay not an enemy, but an order that demanded absolute devotion. He was not there to prove his strength with a sword, but to demonstrate humility before God and obedience to the Master. This was the threshold, the last breath of his old life, and the first step into the secretive brotherhood of the Knights Templar. The candidate's first true trial was not of sword or shield, but of his own heart. After being brought into the chapel, he stood before the master of the temple, who presided over the ritual like both judge and father. Around them, the brothers formed a living wall of silence, their eyes fixed on the man about to renounce his past life. The questioning began with ritual formality. The master would ask the candidate whether he came of his own free will, without coercion or deceit. This was not mere rhetoric. The Templars demanded certainty. A man who joined unwillingly could not be trusted, and a man who sought the order for selfish gain was worse than useless. He was asked, "Do you desire to enter the company of the poor fellow soldiers of Christ, and to serve God all the days of your life?" The questions grew sharper, designed to pierce through pride and uncover hidden motives. Did he owe debts? Was he married or bound by promises to women or lords? Did he carry obligations that would conflict with his new vows? Any hesitation in answering could spell rejection. The Templars sought men unencumbered by divided loyalties, for a divided man could not fight with a pure heart. Then came the questions that tested courage. The master warned him that the life ahead would not be easy. You will know no ease, no wealth, no luxury. You will be called to hunger, to hardship, and to death in the service of Christ. The candidate was reminded that he would wear a simple robe, eat plain food, and surrender any personal possessions. He would obey commands without hesitation, even unto death. This was not romantic knighthood. It was discipline bordering on monastic severity. If the candidate faltered, this was the moment to turn back. Many did. The ritual allowed a man to walk away before making the oath, sparing both him and the order from later regret. But if he stood firm, the master pressed him once more. "Do you still wish to remain?" A resolute answer marked the difference between a mere visitor and a brother in arms. This questioning was not meant to humiliate, but to refine. It stripped away illusions and forced the man to confront the weight of his choice. Only when his answers satisfied the master and the assembled brothers did the ritual move forward. He was now on the very edge of binding himself, not just to an army, but to a holy cause that claimed his soul as much as his sword. Once the candidate had proven his resolve through questioning, the ritual moved into its most sacred phase, the taking of vows. Unlike secular knighthood, which emphasized honor, wealth, and lineage, the Knights Templar demanded the opposite. The initiate was asked to renounce not only earthly pleasures, but also his very sense of independence. The first vow was poverty. Standing before relics of the saints and the cross, he declared that he would own nothing personally. Any wealth, land, or inheritance he possessed would be surrendered to the order. From that moment forward, his bed, his cloak, his sword, even the bread he ate, all belonged not to him, but to Christ through the temple. Poverty was not symbolic. It was total. A Templar knight might have once commanded dozens of servants, but now he would sleep on straw and share meager rations with his brothers. The second vow was chastity. Here the candidate swore to renounce women, marriage, and the comforts of family life. For many knights, this was the hardest oath. To forsake heirs meant to cut off dynastic legacy, a duty that noble families prized above all. Yet the Templars demanded it without hesitation. The initiate swore to love no woman in a carnal sense, devoting all passion instead to Christ and the Virgin Mary. This was one of the reasons the order's rituals later fueled suspicion. In a society where marriage defined one's role, men who cut themselves off from women were seen as unnatural perhaps even dangerous. The third vow was obedience. If poverty demanded surrender of possessions, and chastity demanded surrender of desire, obedience demanded surrender of will. The candidate swore to follow the commands of the master and his superiors instantly and without question, whether on the battlefield or in the cloister. This vow bound the knight as tightly as chains. His life was no longer his own. If commanded to ride into certain death, he would go. If commanded to wait in silence for years, guarding a remote outpost, he would endure. Taken together, these vows stripped a man of the three things most prized in medieval knighthood: wealth, family, and independence. But in their place, the order offered something greater, belonging to a brotherhood that claimed to serve not an earthly lord, but God himself. It was in this surrender that the candidate ceased to be a mere warrior and became a Templar. With the vows spoken, the ritual deepened into a physical act of devotion, the kissing of holy relics. This was no mere gesture of piety. It was the binding seal of the candidate's oaths before him. The altar had been prepared with the most sacred treasures the order possessed: a fragment of the true cross, bones of saints, or a gospel manuscript. These relics were believed to hold divine power, and to touch or kiss them was to invite God himself to witness the promise. The candidate, now kneeling, was guided forward by two senior brothers. He lowered his head in submission, not to the master or the brethren, but to the sacred objects that represented heaven's authority. The first kiss was often upon the cross, a symbolic union with Christ's suffering. This was meant to remind him that the knight's life would be one of sacrifice, hardship, and service, mirroring the sacrifice on Calvary. Next came the relics of saints, men and women who had lived holy lives of endurance and faith. By pressing his lips to their remains, the initiate aligned himself with their legacy. It was a moment of transference where the living pledged to carry the torch of the dead. To refuse the kiss would have been unthinkable, but the act was more than symbolic. In the medieval imagination, to kiss a relic was to form a covenant. Breaking that covenant would endanger one's soul for eternity. The ritual was heavy with silence. The gathered brothers stood still, their white mantles unmoving, while the soft sound of lips against relics echoed in the chapel. The candidate knew that every kiss was not just a kiss of faith, but a kiss of binding. From that moment forward, betrayal would not only shame him before men, but condemn him before God. This act of veneration also added fuel to later myths. Outsiders whispered that the Templars kissed relics in secret rites, or worse, that they kissed forbidden objects of blasphemy. Such rumors spread in later centuries would haunt the order. But in truth, this moment was deeply orthodox. A sacred sealing of vows that mirrored practices found across medieval Christendom. When the final relic was kissed, the initiate was no longer simply a candidate. He was bound by lips and oaths, tied to a chain of faith that stretched back to saints, apostles, and Christ himself. The vows and relics had bound the candidate spiritually, but the order demanded a visible display of humility before he could be welcomed fully. This moment came when he knelt before the master of the temple, a gesture that transformed him from knight of the world to servant of Christ's militia. In medieval society, kneeling was a symbol of fealty, a way of showing submission to a lord. But in the Templar rite, the meaning was even deeper. The candidate knelt not to a man, but to the discipline and divine mission embodied by the master. The ritual was simple, but heavy with meaning. The candidate sank on both knees, head bowed, his hands pressed together as if in prayer. This posture was no accident. It echoed the way a vassal pledged loyalty to a feudal lord, yet stripped of the worldly rewards that came with such service. Here there would be no lands, no castles, no riches promised in return. Instead, the knight was binding himself to poverty, chastity, obedience, and the perpetual hardships of holy war. The master placed his hands over the candidates, sealing the act with authority. Then came the words of command, a reminder that from this moment forward, the initiate must obey without hesitation. Whether the order was to ride into battle, to guard a lonely fortress in the desert, or to spend years in prayer and fasting, his duty was absolute. Obedience was not a matter of negotiation. It was total. Yet there was also comfort in this kneeling. For all its severity, the order was a brotherhood. The candidate was no longer an isolated warrior, but a part of a chain of loyalty and protection. By kneeling, he signaled his willingness to be shaped, disciplined, and defended by his brothers as much as he was now bound to serve them. Observers outside the chapel might have seen only a knight kneeling before another man, but within the order, this act carried a mystical dimension. To kneel was to die to the self, to cast aside pride, and to be reborn in service to God's will. It was the act that broke the knight's worldly identity and remade him into a Templar. When a master raised him up, he was no longer a supplicant. He was a brother marked by humility, yet bound to carry himself with the unshakable strength of one who served not kings, but the kingdom of heaven. After kneeling before the master, the initiate was not yet complete. The ritual reached its communal stage, his acceptance among the brethren. If the vows had tied him to God, and the kneeling had bound him to obedience, this next step with him into the living fabric of the order itself. The gathered knights, standing in solemn ranks, now became witnesses and guarantors of his new life. They were not silent spectators. Their presence mattered. In the dim light of the chapel, their white mantles with the crimson cross created a striking image, reminding the candidate of the purity demanded and the blood he might one day spill. Each brother had endured the same questioning, sworn the same vows, and bent the same knee. To be admitted into their company was not simply to join an army. It was to become part of a spiritual family. At this point, the master would turn to the assembly and ask if any brother had reason to oppose the new initiate. It was a dramatic moment filled with tension. If someone knew of a hidden sin, an unresolved oath, or a dishonorable act from the candidate's past, he was bound to speak. Silence was agreement. It meant that the man was accepted as pure enough for the temple. The weight of collective approval was immense. Acceptance was not only by the master, but by the entire brotherhood. Once no objection was raised, the master declared the candidate a Templar. At this pronouncement, the atmosphere shifted. The brothers, who had until then remained rigid and distant, now welcomed him with a gesture of fraternity. Some rituals mentioned the kiss of peace, where each knight greeted the new brother with a kiss on the cheek, a sign of spiritual kinship. Others describe a symbolic embrace, bringing the initiate physically into the fold. This moment of acceptance carried enormous significance. The knight was no longer alone, no longer a wandering warrior with only his sword for company. He had gained hundreds of brothers who would fight, pray, eat, and even die beside him. Yet the secrecy surrounding these rites, especially the kiss of peace, fueled later rumors that the Templars harbored strange, even heretical practices. Outsiders, excluded from the chapel, imagined sinister oaths and blasphemous acts. But for the brothers themselves, it was simply the sacred confirmation of belonging, a visible sign that the candidate had passed from solitude into the eternal fellowship of the temple. The culmination of the initiation was marked by a transformation, and so simple yet so profound that it became the most enduring symbol of the Knights Templar, the investiture with the white mantle. For a medieval knight, clothing was never just fabric. It declared rank, wealth, and allegiance. To be stripped of one garment and given another was to shed an old identity and assume a new one. The candidate, still kneeling, was brought before the altar once more. A senior brother stepped forward, carrying the mantle, a plain white cloak marked with the crimson cross. Its simplicity stood in stark contrast to the rich tunics and colorful heraldry that most knights wore. Where other warriors adorned themselves with family crests and gold embroidery, the Templar mantle declared humility, purity, and absolute devotion. The red cross stitched over the heart was not decoration, but a reminder. Blood might be demanded and sacrifice was inevitable. The master spoke as the garment was placed upon the initiate's shoulders. He explained that the whiteness symbolized chastity and spiritual cleanliness, while the cross was both burden and blessing. To wear the mantle was to proclaim before all men that he had renounced the world. Wherever he traveled, from Paris to Jerusalem, from dusty roads to royal courts, his cloak announced him as a Templar, bound by vows that set him apart. This investiture was often accompanied by warnings. The master would remind the new knight that if he should ever betray his vows, the mantle would become a curse rather than a blessing. To disgrace the cross was to invite eternal damnation. The garment once bestowed was not merely clothing, but a sign of spiritual marriage to the order. It cannot be worn lightly. The chapel would fall in a hushed reverence as the initiate rose, now cloaked in white and red. For the first time, he stood visibly as a Templar knight. The assembled brethren saw not a candidate, but a brother, clothed in the same colors that they themselves bore. The moment carried both pride and dread. Pride because the new knight had entered one of the most powerful orders in Christendom. Dread because from this day forward every step, every battle, every prayer, and every breath would be lived under the shadow of that red cross. The mantle was glory and burden entwined. No initiation was complete without a meal, not a lavish feast, but a communal table where the new knight took his place among his brothers for the first time. In medieval society, to eat together was more than sustenance. It was a declaration of kinship. For the Templars, whose lives were ruled by discipline, the shared meal carried profound symbolic weight. The banquet was modest, reflecting the vow of poverty. There were no golden goblets, no extravagant dishes dripping with spice, no musicians to provide entertainment. Instead, the knights sat shoulder to shoulder at long wooden tables, eating plain fare, bread, broth, beans, perhaps roasted meat, if available. Each portion was measured, and indulgence was forbidden. The silence of the earlier ceremony gave way to murmured prayers and quiet conversation, the steady rhythm of spoons against bowls. For the new initiate, this was the first test of belonging. He was no longer an outsider standing before the order, but a brother at their table. By eating the same food, drinking the same watered wine, and following the same rules, he stepped fully into the rhythm of Templar life. Here there were no noblemen or peasants, no sons of lords or commoners, only brothers bound by vows. The equality of the table was one of the order's greatest strengths. The master or senior officers often used this moment to remind the initiate of the rules that govern meals. Conversation was limited and focused, often revolving around scripture, discipline, or practical matters of the campaign. Excess was forbidden. Even gestures agreed, like reaching too quickly for food, could bring reprimand. The meal itself was a continuation of the vows. Simplicity, obedience, and humility played out in the act of eating. This banquet also had a spiritual layer. To break bread together was to echo the Last Supper, the fellowship of Christ and his disciples. Just as the knights had sworn oaths before relics, now they confirmed their unity through shared sustenance. The initiate, tasting the plain bread and wine, knew he was bound to these men not just in battle, but in daily life, in hunger, and in prayer. By the time the meal ended, the new knight had fully crossed the threshold. He had been questioned, tested, bound by oaths, and now nourished by the same food as his brothers. What remained was the final blessing, the sealing of his place in the spiritual army of the temple. The last stage of the initiation was both solemn and uplifting, the final blessing that sealed the knight into eternal brotherhood. Everything that had come before, the questioning, the vows, the kneeling, the relics, the mantle, and the meal, led to this culminating act. Now before God and his brethren, the initiate was consecrated as a full Templar. The chapel grew still once more. The master stood before the new knight, lifting his hands in blessing. Words of prayer were spoken invoking Christ, the Virgin Mary, and the saints as witnesses to the vows just taken. This blessing was not symbolic, but binding. The initiate was believed to be spiritually marked, set apart from the rest of Christendom. No longer a free knight of the world, he was now a soldier of Christ, sworn to defend the faith until death. Some accounts suggest that the blessing also carried a warning. The master reminded the new brother that to break his vows was to betray not only the order, but God himself. Damnation, both earthly disgrace and eternal punishment, awaited those who faltered. It was a sobering reminder that this brotherhood was not something to be entered lightly. Once bound, there was no release, only life in service or death in disgrace. After the blessing, the brethren together recited prayers surrounding the new knight in a chorus of Latin chants. The effect was overwhelming, the sound of voices echoing against stone walls, a wave of devotion that swept him into the rhythm of the order. For the initiate, it was both a farewell to the life he had left behind and a welcome into something eternal. At last, the master declared him a brother of the temple. A murmur of approval moved through the ranks. The knights approached, offering the kiss of peace or the clasp of hands, small gestures that carried enormous weight. With these, he was no longer an outsider, but one of them bound to fight, pray, and die alongside them. When he stepped out of the chapel, clothed in white, bearing the red cross, the world would see only a knight. But within the order, he was something greater. A man transformed, consecrated, and forever bound by vows of loyalty, sacrifice, and faith. His life was no longer his own. It belonged to the temple and to God. In the bustling streets of Pompeii, where merchants called out their wares and carts rattled over stone roads, there stood a building unlike any other. The Lupanar, the city's most notorious brothel. To the casual visitor, Pompeii might appear as a model Roman town with its forum, temples, and public baths. But woven into that same fabric of daily life was the open trade of sex, not hidden, not whispered about, but displayed with the same practicality as bread or wine. The Lupanar was the centerpiece of this trade, an institution as much a part of Pompeii's economy as its markets. The very name, Lupanar, reveals how Romans viewed its function. Derived from the Latin word luper, meaning she-wolf, it was a slang term for prostitute. Just as a wolf prowls the wilderness, these women were imagined as prowling for clients. Yet in reality, it was the customers who prowled the city, following carved phallic symbols etched into paving stones and walls that literally pointed the way to the brothel's doors. For a Roman man, whether soldier, sailor, or merchant, there was little secrecy in such pursuits. Pompeii wore its sexuality openly, and the Lupanar made no attempt to hide its purpose. From the outside, the building was ordinary, blending with the other stone structures around it. But step through its narrow entrance, and you entered a different world. The air was heavy with the smell of oil lamps, cheap wine, and bodies pressed into small, stifling rooms. The voices of clients bargaining, the laughter of women trained to seduce, and the scrolled graffiti of past visitors all testified that this was not a place of fleeting use. It was a social hub, a regular stop in the daily rhythm of Roman men. Unlike temples, which promised divine ecstasy, or taverns, which promised escape and drink, the Lupanar promised immediate physical satisfaction. It was in many ways the theater of desire, where the performance never stopped. Some came in groups, others alone, but all found the same blunt efficiency. Stone beds, straw mattresses, and painted walls that advertised what could be purchased. To enter the Lupanar was not to step outside Roman life, but to step directly into it. Here in this dim, narrow building, one could glimpse the raw intersection of economy, desire, and social custom, the side of Pompeii that the ash of Vuvius would preserve for eternity. From the outside, the Lupanar looked like any other stone building in Pompeii, its facade blending in with taverns, shops, and homes. But once inside, its architecture revealed a singular purpose: efficiency in the service of desire. Unlike lavish Roman villas decorated with mosaics and atriums open to the sky, this brothel was built with narrow corridors, cramped chambers, and a dark intimacy that left little space for lingering. The building itself was 2 stories tall. The ground floor housed 5 small rooms, each with a built-in stone bed. These were little more than cubicles, windowless, airless, and sparsely furnished. A thin mattress stuffed with straw or cloth was laid across the stone platform, often covered with a rough blanket. Comfort was not the goal. Durability was. The stone ensured that the beds could withstand constant use without splintering or collapsing, while straw could easily be replaced when fouled. For the average Pompeian man, this was enough. Sex was a transaction, not a romance. A staircase led to the 2nd floor where the atmosphere was slightly different. The rooms upstairs were larger, brighter, and often reserved for wealthier clients. Here, visitors might find wooden beds, softer coverings, or a touch of privacy absent downstairs. Those who could afford to pay more sought not only pleasure, but also comfort, and the architecture reflected this hierarchy of experience. At the center of the brothel was a small stone staircase, the artery that connected rich and poor upstairs and downstairs. Fleeting encounters and longer indulgences. The walls themselves serve a role in guiding customers. Phallic carvings pointed toward the rooms, almost like arrows, ensuring that even strangers could navigate the building. The brothel was practical, but it was also symbolic. The cramped ground floor rooms represented the raw, unvarnished side of Roman sexuality, quick, transactional, and accessible to all. The upper rooms reflected the stratification of Roman society, where wealth could still purchase luxury, even in the pursuit of lust. Together, they formed a microcosm of Pompeian life, class divisions, economic realities, and human desire, all compressed into a single structure. To walk its halls was to step into a machine built for one purpose. Every corner of the Lupanar, from the echo of footsteps on stone floors to the flicker of oil lamps against frescoed walls, reminded the visitor that this was not a home or a temple, but a marketplace of flesh. Perhaps the most striking feature of the Lupanar, and the one that has fascinated historians and tourists alike, are the erotic fresco painted above the doorways of its small rooms. These images were not abstract decorations or veiled hints. They were explicit, colorful depictions of sexual acts preserved remarkably well under the ash of Mount Vesuvius. To walk into the brothel was to be confronted by a literal catalog of desire, a visual menu that guided the client in his choices. In a city where literacy rates were limited, especially among slaves, foreigners, and lower-caste visitors, these paintings were practical. A traveler who did not speak Latin, or a client who could not read, could still point at the image that matched his preference. Each fresco depicted couples in different positions or scenarios, leaving little room for modesty or ambiguity. The Romans did not cloak sexuality in euphemism here. They displayed it with the same matter-of-fact clarity as a baker displaying loaves of bread. The placement of these fresco also carried symbolic weight. They were positioned above each room's doorway, almost like signboards in a shop. Some scholars argue that they functioned as advertisements for what might be available inside, while others believe they were more general illustrations meant to inspire arousal. Either way, the effect was unmistakable. The walls themselves became salesmen guiding the eye and the imagination. The artistry was crude by the standards of Roman villas, which often boasted refined, mythological frescoes. But what the Lupanar's images lacked in polish, they made up for in clarity. The bold lines, exaggerated bodies, and unembarrassed poses conveyed exactly what was on offer. And unlike the subtle eroticism found in elite homes, these frescoes were unashamedly transactional. They existed to facilitate business. Interestingly, these menus may also have functioned as a form of regulation. By displaying a range of acts openly, the brothel standardized expectations, ensuring that both client and prostitute understood the terms. This efficiency reduced disputes, much like a tavern posting prices for wine. For archaeologists, the fresco are more than titillation. They provide rare insight into the sexual economy of Pompeii, revealing not only the practices, but also the attitudes of a society where desire was commodified. They remind us that the Lupanar was not a hidden den of shame, but an openly advertised marketplace of pleasure, where walls spoke louder than words. Behind the painted walls and stone beds of the Lupanar were the women themselves, the central figures of Pompeii's sex trade. Their lives were harsh, their labor relentless, and their status almost always marginalized. Unlike the courtesans of later European history, the prostitutes of Pompeii were rarely free women choosing this profession. Most were slaves purchased or captured from distant provinces brought into the city as commodities in the same way as grain, wine, or olive oil. The Lupanar's women came from across the Roman Empire, Gaul, Greece, Syria, North Africa. Their foreign origins were sometimes advertised as exotic attractions, appealing to clients who desired novelty. These women often had their identities stripped away, given simple Romanized names such as Fortunata, Lucky One, or Prima the First. Such names reduced them to functions, cataloged like items in a market stall. Their daily existence was grueling. From morning until late at night, they worked in tiny, airless rooms, often servicing multiple clients in succession. Payment was collected quickly, usually a single coin, sometimes the equivalent of a loaf of bread. The women kept almost nothing for themselves. Earnings were claimed by the brothel's owner. Even their bodies were not truly their own, subject to the demands of strangers and the rules of the establishment. Yet within this bleak reality, traces of individuality survive. Graffiti scratched onto the walls of the Lupener preserve snippets of the women's voices, boasts, names, and even playful remarks left for future clients to read. Some inscriptions reveal pride and skill, others bitterness at exploitation. These fragments remind us that the women were not faceless commodities, but human beings with wit, frustration, and resilience. The stigma they bore was immense. Roman society tolerated prostitution, but did not honor it. Prostitutes were legally classified as infames, a status that stripped them of many rights. They could not marry respectable citizens, inherit property, or participate fully in civic life. The brothel gave them visibility, but not dignity. Still, these women were essential to Pompeii's economy and social fabric. They provided a service openly demanded by men of all classes, from slaves to senators. And though their names have largely been lost to history, the ash of Vuvius has preserved the traces of their labor, their voices, and their silent endurance inside the narrow chambers of the Lupener. If the women of the Lupener were its labor force, the clients were its lifeblood. To understand Pompeii's brothel, one must understand the men who filled its rooms. Contrary to the assumption that prostitution was the indulgence of only the poor or desperate, the Lupener's clientele spanned all ranks of Roman society, from slaves with a single coin in hand to merchants fresh from trading voyages, from soldiers stationed nearby to local elites seeking anonymity, all passed through its narrow doorway. The affordability of services made the brothel accessible to nearly everyone. A visit could cost as little as a single A, roughly the price of a loaf of bread. This meant that even the lowest laborer could purchase a moment of pleasure. For wealthier patrons, the upstairs rooms offered more comfort, a softer bed, and perhaps the illusion of exclusivity. Yet the act itself remained the same. Quick, transactional, stripped of romance. Graffiti scrolled across the walls reveals not only the presence of clients, but also their personalities. Some proudly recorded their visits. "I had a great time here with Fortunata." Others left crude boasts of their virility, turning the walls into a ledger of masculine ego. A few inscriptions even read like customer reviews praising or mocking the women by name. These writings, casual yet permanent, paint a vivid picture of how normalized brothel visits were in Pompeian life. For Roman men, there was little stigma in visiting a prostitute. Married men often sought out the Lupener without shame. Fidelity was expected from wives, not husbands. Roman law and custom viewed sex with prostitutes as acceptable, even practical. It provided an outlet that in the eyes of many protected respectable women from male appetites. Thus, the brothel became not only a place of pleasure, but also an institution that reinforced the double standards of Roman morality. At the same time, the Lupener offered more than just physical release. It was also a social space, a place where men could drink, boast, and carve their names into eternity. It functioned as part tavern, part club, and part stage for performances of masculinity. In a world where status and reputation defined identity, leaving a mark on the walls of the brothel was for some men as important as leaving one on the battlefield. The clients of the Lupener were not a hidden subculture. They were Pompeii itself, the traders, soldiers, and citizens who made the city thrive, and who saw no contradiction between civic duty and nightly indulgence. If the frescoes of the Lupener were the official advertisements, the graffiti carved and scratched into its walls were the unofficial commentary, a chorus of voices echoing through time. Few ancient buildings offer such an intimate glimpse into daily life as this brothel, where the walls became a canvas for humor, pride, lust, and frustration. Visitors left behind crude boasts of their conquests. One inscription reads, "I screwed many girls here." Another, more specific, names the prostitute. "I had a good time with Fortunata for 1 coin." These graffiti blur the line between casual bragging and customer reviews, giving us a rare sense of how men spoke of their experiences in unfiltered honesty. Some comments even praise or criticize the women's skills, making the Lupener's walls one of the earliest forms of public rating systems. But not all graffiti came from clients. Some of the women themselves inscribed their names or brief statements, reclaiming a voice in a place where their lives were otherwise controlled. These scribbles often reveal pride, wit, or defiance. One woman etched her name beside a heart, a reminder that even in the harshest conditions, individuality could not be erased. For archaeologists, these markings are invaluable, transforming faceless workers into real human beings who laughed, loved, and endured. Other graffiti reveal the social mix of the brothel. Soldiers scrolled crude drawings of shields or phallic symbols. Merchants recorded names, and travelers carved jokes in foreign scripts. The brothel became not just a site of sex, but a cultural meeting point, a melting pot of languages and classes united by common appetite. Interestingly, some inscriptions veered into the philosophical. One reads, "Weepy girls, my penis has given you up. Now it pursues men's behinds." Crude humor perhaps, but also a playful declaration of identity in a society that tolerated a wide range of sexual expression. These walls captured it all: bragging, mockery, wit, and even glimpses of vulnerability. The Lupiner's graffiti are more than vulgar doodles. They are a living archive of Pompeii's humanity, voices of men and women who never expected to be remembered. Unlike the polished fresco meant to seduce the eye, the graffiti spoke the raw language of the street. Today they remind us that ancient people were not statues or myths, but flesh and blood humans who left their marks literally for history to find. The Lupiner was not just a house of pleasure. It was a business tightly woven into Pompeii's urban economy. In a city teeming with merchants, sailors, and travelers, the brothel operated with the same pragmatism as a bakery or tavern. Its success depended on accessibility, affordability, and a steady flow of customers. And like any well-run enterprise, it catered to both the common man and the wealthy elite. Prices were shockingly low. Inscriptions suggest that a visit could cost as little as one is the price of a loaf of bread. For a single coin, a soldier or laborer could secure a few moments in one of the ground floor cubicles. The upstairs rooms, reserved for wealthier patrons, commanded higher fees. Here, comfort could be bought. Wooden beds instead of stone, softer blankets, perhaps more privacy. Yet, even in these rooms, the encounter remained transactional, stripped of sentiment. The money collected did not stay with the women. Most of them were slaves, and their earnings went directly to the brothel's owner, who might have been a wealthy Pompeian citizen running multiple businesses. In some cases, freed women could work independently, paying a cut of their profits to the manager. But for the majority, the Lupiner was simply another cog in the machinery of Roman slavery. Their bodies a commodity, their labor a profit stream. The scale of business was considerable. With 10 rooms, constant traffic, and low prices, the brothel could serve dozens of clients daily. Multiply that by weeks, months, and years, and the Lupiner becomes not just a building, but an engine of steady income. For Pompeii's economy, already fueled by trade and tourism, the sex industry provided an additional layer of commerce that few considered scandalous. Beyond money, the Lupiner also supported secondary businesses. Taverns nearby sold wine to loosened tongues and purses. Vendors shocked food to men leaving the brothel. Even the graffiti carved into its walls had an economic angle. Names of prostitutes became brands. Repeat clients functioned as word-of-mouth marketing, and the fresco acted as permanent advertising. In short, the Lupiner was a commercial hub disguised as a brothel. Its walls reveal a world where sex was not taboo but trade, where desire was monetized with brutal efficiency. Pompeii's economy thrived on bread, wine, olive oil, and flesh. To modern eyes, the openness of the Lupiner seemed startling. But in Roman society, prostitution occupied a curious place, both tolerated and stigmatized. It was legal, taxed, and integrated into city life. Yet the women who worked there were branded as infames, dishonored, and excluded from respectable society. This paradox defined the brothel, a place many men used without shame, yet one that carried deep social stigma for those inside it. For Roman men, visiting a prostitute was no moral failing. Husbands could enter the Lupiner without disgrace. even while expecting absolute fidelity from their wives. A wife's duty was to safeguard lineage and property, while her husband's excursions to brothel were considered an acceptable outlet. Double standards were built into Roman law and custom. The act was not about love, but control. Men's appetites were legitimized while women's sexuality was tightly policed. The prostitutes, however, bore the full weight of stigma. As in fames, they were stripped of rights. They could not marry respectable citizens, testify in court, or inherit wealth. Their bodies were public property in the eyes of the law. Even freed women who entered the trade voluntarily remained socially tainted, unable to climb into respectability. To be marked as a prostitute was to be permanently branded regardless of wealth or age. Yet society could not function without them. Moralists like Seneca and philosophers like Cicero acknowledged that prostitution kept social order, providing a sanctioned outlet for male desire. Augustus himself regulated the trade, requiring prostitutes to register with authorities. Thus, Rome institutionalized what it also despised, weaving brothel into the very fabric of its cities. The stigma extended to space itself. The Lupanar was located not in Pompeii's elite districts, but in a working-class quarter near taverns and shops. Respectable women would not pass its threshold, nor would noble families openly acknowledge its existence. Yet its clients came from every stratum. The building was both central and marginal, a paradox carved into stone. This tension between tolerance and shame is what makes the Lupanar so revealing. It was neither hidden nor celebrated, but accepted as a necessary, even useful part of Roman life. The brothel embodied the contradictions of Roman morality: desire and discipline, acceptance and condemnation, woven together in a city that lived comfortably with both. When Mount Vuvius erupted in 79 CE, it did more than destroy Pompeii. It preserved it. The Lupanar, like the rest of the city, was entombed under layers of ash and pumice, sealing within its walls a snapshot of Roman life that might otherwise have vanished. Unlike Rome itself, where centuries of rebuilding erased much of the past, Pompeii remained frozen in an instant, offering archaeologists an unparalleled time capsule. The Lupanar's survival is extraordinary. The stone beds still stand in their cramped cubicles, worn smooth from countless encounters. The erotic fresco remain vivid, their colors protected by volcanic ash, their scenes of desire shockingly direct to modern viewers. Graffiti lines the walls just as it did nearly 2,000 years ago, preserving the casual boasts of clients and the names of women whose lives would otherwise be forgotten. Every scratch, every crude drawing, every boastful word became immortal the moment Vuvius erupted. For historians, the Lupanar is more than a curiosity. It is evidence of how openly the Romans integrated sexuality into their urban world. The brothel was not an exception, but an institution legal, regulated, and normalized. Its preservation forces us to confront the reality of Roman life, not through myth or idealized literature, but through the raw, unpolished remnants of daily transactions. The legacy of the Lupanar also lies in its contradictions. It reveals a society that commodified human bodies while celebrating sexual freedom, that allowed men to indulge without shame while condemning women to lives of stigma. It challenges modern notions of morality, forcing us to ask uncomfortable questions about power, exploitation, and desire in ancient societies. Today, visitors to Pompeii often make the Lupanar one of their first stops, drawn by curiosity and the promise of scandal. Yet those narrow stone rooms are not merely salacious relics. They are memorials to lives lived in shadows, women who labored without recognition, men who scrolled their names into eternity, and a city that saw no contradiction in mixing commerce with lust. The Lupanar endures as Pompeii's most infamous building, a place where economy, desire, and human frailty collided. Preserved by catastrophe, it speaks across millennia, reminding us that beneath the grandeur of Rome lay the unvarnished truth of its people, hungry, flawed, passionate, and profoundly human. In Sparta, marriage was never about romance, candlelit evenings, or tender vows. It was first and foremost a duty to the state, an obligation wrapped in ritual, designed to serve the city's unrelenting demand for strength. Unlike Athens, where marriages centered on family alliances and the management of households, Sparta had one clear priority: the production of strong children who would grow into fearless soldiers and resilient mothers. The personal desires of the bride and groom mattered little in comparison to the collective needs of the community. The Spartan system was unique in the ancient Greek world. Every institution, from education to religion, was geared towards sustaining a military powerhouse. Men spent the majority of their lives in the AOG, the harsh training program that molded them into warriors. Women were expected to be equally resilient, trained in physical exercise so they would bear healthy offspring. Within this framework, marriage was not a private arrangement, but a civic responsibility. A couple's union was viewed through the lens of what it could contribute to Sparta's future armies. This mentality shaped every aspect of their customs. For Spartans, a wedding was less about joy and more about efficiency. The state intervened heavily, ensuring that unions were not based on whim, but on practical considerations: age, strength, and fertility. Even myths about Spartan weddings reinforce this utilitarian ethos. The idea that two people might marry for affection or personal preference was seen as weak, even dangerous. Love could distract a warrior from his duty, while indulgence and luxury was a threat to Sparta's austere way of life. Yet, despite this cold practicality, Spartan marriages carried a strange kind of equality. Unlike in other Greek city-states, Spartan women were not confined to the shadows of the household. They owned land, managed estates, and spoke openly in public. Their role in marriage was therefore more balanced, not as submissive dependent, but as partners tasked with maintaining the Spartan bloodline. The rituals that surrounded weddings reflected this duality: harsh, even brutal, yet deeply symbolic of shared strength. In the end, a Spartan marriage was not two individuals binding themselves to each other for love, but two citizens binding themselves to Sparta. Their union was another weapon in the city's arsenal, forged not in passion, but in the fires of necessity. In Sparta, the timing of marriage was not left to chance, nor was it guided by personal desire. The state carefully dictated when its citizens could wed, ensuring that the institution served its military and demographic needs above all else. Unlike other Greek city-states, where men often married young to secure household stability, Spartans followed a strict pattern. Men delayed marriage until the age of 30, while women typically married much earlier in their late teens or early 20s. This unusual gap in age was no accident. By 30, a Spartan man was considered seasoned, having endured the full rigor of the agoga, the grueling military training system that began in childhood. Only after proving himself as a disciplined warrior, capable of obedience and endurance, was he seen as fit to assume the responsibilities of marriage. The state demanded that men demonstrate loyalty to Sparta before they could be trusted with loyalty to a household. Marriage, in other words, was a reward for survival and service. For women, the logic was different. Spartan girls were raised to be strong, athletic, and resilient. Their training, including running, wrestling, and even javelin throwing. This physical discipline was not to prepare them for battle, but for motherhood. The ideal Spartan bride was one who could endure childbirth and produce vigorous children. By marrying young, women entered their most fertile years under the watchful eye of the state, aligning their personal lives with Sparta's goal of breeding strong offspring. The result was a sharp contrast: experienced warriors marrying youthful, physically robust women. This pairing embodied the Spartan vision of balance: seasoned male strength joined with female vitality. The household was not built on affection, but on calculated utility, with both partners chosen at the optimal moment for contributing to the city's survival. Yet, paradoxically, this arrangement gave Spartan women more influence than their counterparts elsewhere. Because men remained in barracks until 30, even after marriage, wives often managed estates and finances in their husband's absence. This created an unusual dynamic where women were younger, but not powerless, entrusted with responsibilities that Athenian women could scarcely imagine. Thus, the age of marriage in Sparta reflected more than biology. It reflected ideology. It was a timetable crafted by the state, ensuring that marriage served not personal romance, but the perpetual machinery of war. Few customs in the ancient world were as striking or as unsettling as the Spartan treatment of brides on their wedding night. Unlike the flowing dresses and elaborate hairstyles of Athenian or Corinthian brides, Spartan women were stripped of their femininity before entering marriage. Their heads were shaved clean, their bodies dressed in a man's cloak, and simple sandals replaced any hint of adornment. In this moment, the bride was transformed not into a delicate wife, but into something resembling a young warrior. Why such an unusual ritual? The symbolism was twofold. First, it reflected Sparta's rejection of luxury and vanity. Long hair, jewelry, and perfumes were markers of wealth and softness, traits despised in a society that valued austerity and discipline. By shaving the bride's head, Sparta stripped away beauty as ornament, forcing the union to rest on strength, not appearance. Second, the disguise blurred the lines between male and female. Spartan marriage was not about a passive woman joining a dominant man. Instead, the bride's transformation emphasized her role as a partner, one expected to endure hardship and contribute to the Spartan ideal of strength. Dressed in male clothing, she embodied toughness and equality, signaling that she was not to be treated as fragile. This practice was unique in Greece, where most women were confined to the household and expected to embody submissive modesty. The act also carried a deeper psychological purpose. To a Spartan groom accustomed to spending his life among men in military barracks, the transition to marriage could be jarring. By presenting the bride in an androgynous form, the ritual softened this shift, bridging the gap between male camaraderie and heterosexual union. Over time, as hair grew back and the woman adopted her new role as wife, the transformation was complete. She was now both hardened like her husband and capable of producing the next generation of warriors. Though strange to modern eyes, this shaving ritual reveals how deeply Sparta fused gender roles with civic duty. The bride's body was remade into a symbol of resilience, a living reminder that marriage in Sparta was not about romance or beauty, but about survival, strength, and the creation of a unified, disciplined household. In most Greek cities, weddings were public celebrations filled with music, banquets, and processions. In Sparta, however, the union of husband and wife began with something that looked more like a raid than a ceremony: the ritual abduction of the bride. Far from a romantic gesture, this practice symbolized strength, control, and the transfer of the woman into her new role as wife. After the bride had her head shaved and was dressed in male clothing, she was secretly abducted by her groom. The act was not violent in the sense of a real kidnapping. It was staged with both families aware of the custom. Yet the symbolism was powerful. The groom carried her away from her family home to a private chamber, marking the decisive moment when she left her old life behind. The ritual carried layers of meaning. First, it echoed the military culture of Sparta. Just as Spartan men were trained to seize and endure through force, the abduction dramatized marriage as a conquest, not of love, but of duty. The woman, stripped of her feminine markers, was taken into a new world where she would serve Sparta as mother of warriors. Second, the abduction reinforced secrecy and restraint. Unlike other Greek weddings, there was no grand feast or display for the community. Instead, the first meeting between bride and groom was hidden, solemn, and controlled. The marriage bond was not meant for public spectacle, but for private strength, reflecting Sparta's disdain for extravagance. Perhaps most intriguing was the way this ritual fit into the larger system of male life in Sparta. Even after marriage, men continued to live in military barracks until the age of 30. For years, a husband would often visit his wife only at night, slipping secretly into her quarters and leaving before dawn. Some scholars suggest this secrecy kept passion alive by maintaining a sense of novelty. Others argue it symbolized the subordination of marriage to military life, a reminder that no man's household could ever take precedence over Sparta's army. For the bride, the abduction marked her transformation. She was no longer her father's daughter, but a Spartan wife, bound not only to her husband, but to the city itself. For the groom, it was both a rite of dominance and a test of discipline, proof that even in love, he acted under Sparta's rules. For most cultures, marriage meant a new household, shared meals, and daily life as husband and wife. In Sparta, things were very different. Even after the wedding night, the husband did not move in with his bride. Instead, he returned to the military barracks where Spartan men were required to live until the age of 30. Marriage therefore began with separation rather than togetherness. The bride meanwhile remained in her family home or in a household prepared for her. She managed domestic affairs and land roles that carried far more weight in Sparta than in other Greek states. Because men spent most of their lives training or at war, Spartan women bore responsibility for running estates, supervising helot laborers, and ensuring the household prospered. In many ways, a wife was the true economic backbone of the family, while her husband continued his service to the state. Conjugal visits were often secretive. A young husband might slip away at night to meet his wife in private, returning to his barracks before dawn. These clandestine encounters added an unusual intensity to early married life. Some historians believe this secrecy kept desire alive, preventing the familiarity that could dull passion. Others see it as a clear reminder that a man's primary loyalty was to his fellow warriors, not to his spouse. For the bride, this arrangement could be both empowering and isolating. On one hand, she was entrusted with authority uncommon for women elsewhere in Greece. While Athenian wives lived secluded lives, Spartan women managed wealth and made decisions in their husband's absence. On the other hand, the emotional distance created by the husband's absence shaped a marriage that was more functional than affectionate. Children were the ultimate goal. When a couple produced a healthy son, they had fulfilled their duty to Sparta. Daughters, too, were valued as they would grow into the next generation of strong Spartan mothers. The household success was measured not in romance, but in contribution to the state's population of warriors. Thus, life after the wedding night was marked by paradox. Spartan marriages were austere, even cold by modern standards. Yet, they granted women unusual power and independence. They were unions forged not for companionship, but for survival, partnerships designed to serve a city where war always came first. In most of ancient Greece, women lived in seclusion, confined to the household, and excluded from political and economic life. Sparta was radically different. Spartan women held a unique position of power, and marriage only strengthened it. Far from being silent figures in the background, they were active participants in the state's survival. The central role of a Spartan wife was motherhood, but not just in the biological sense. She was expected to produce strong, healthy children capable of becoming warriors or mothers of warriors. To achieve this, Spartan girls were raised in a way that shocked other Greeks. They trained physically from youth. They ran, wrestled, and threw javelins. Their bodies hardened not for battle, but for childbirth. The ideal Spartan woman was athletic, resilient, and unafraid. Marriage built upon this foundation, transforming her from daughter into bearer of the city's future. But her responsibilities extended far beyond the cradle. Because husbands were tied to barracks until 30, and even afterward, often away on campaign, wives became de facto heads of households. They managed estates, oversaw helots, the enslaved laborers who worked Spartan farms, and handled economic matters with authority. The Spartan wife controlled wealth and property in ways that Athenian women could scarcely imagine. In fact, by some accounts, women in Sparta eventually controlled nearly 2/5 of the land, a staggering figure in the patriarchal ancient world. Their influence also reached the social and cultural sphere. Spartan mothers were famously bold, known for sayings that encapsulated the city's ethos. Return with your shield or on it, they told their sons heading to war. This blunt encouragement to embrace victory or death reflected the same values marriage demanded: strength, duty, and sacrifice to the state above all else. Marriage did not diminish a woman's independence. In many ways, it magnified it. While bound by ritual and expectation, Spartan wives wielded significant power within their families and communities. They were respected, even feared for their sharp tongues and uncompromising standards. Men might dominate the battlefield, but women ensured that Sparta's warrior society never faltered at home. In this way, the role of women in Spartan marriage was paradoxical. They were subjected to the state's demands, yet they held authority that few women elsewhere in Greece could dream of. Marriage in Sparta bound women to the city's military ethos, but it also gave them the strength and space to shape its destiny. In Sparta, marriage was not judged by affection, wealth, or prestige. Its true measure was children. The state expected every union to contribute to its most vital resource, a steady stream of strong, disciplined citizens who could sustain the Spartan military machine. Producing the next generation was not simply a private family matter. It was a civic duty, one scrutinized by the community. From a moment of marriage, couples were under pressure to have children quickly. Sons were especially prized, for they would one day enter the Aeog and become warriors. Yet, daughters were far from unwanted. Strong women were valued as the future mothers of warriors. In fact, Spartan girls were raised with the same emphasis on physical health as boys, ensuring they would one day endure childbirth and produce healthy offspring. The obsession with strength led to unusual practices. If a husband was too old or infertile, the state might encourage his wife to conceive with a younger or stronger man. Unlike in other Greek cities, this was not considered scandalous. It was pragmatic. The goal was to ensure that no womb went to waste, that every marriage produced children who would serve Sparta. Some sources even suggest that men could allow their wives to sleep with particularly strong warriors in order to breed better offspring, treating reproduction almost like selective training for animals. Newborns, once delivered, faced harsh scrutiny. Elders inspected infants to determine if they were healthy and strong enough to survive. Weak or deformed babies could be abandoned, a chilling practice that reflected Sparta's ruthless dedication to strength. For those deemed fit, childhood was brief, for boys were soon taken from their mothers to begin training in the AOG. Mothers, though deeply attached, were expected to accept this as part of their duty. Marriage then was inseparable from the state's eugenic ambitions. Couples were not simply building families. They were producing soldiers and mothers, the raw material of Sparta's future. Even intimacy itself was subordinated to this aim. The rituals, secrecy, and discipline surrounding Spartan marriage were all geared toward one outcome: a next generation capable of sustaining the city's way of life. For Spartans, love was fleeting, but legacy was eternal. A successful marriage was not one that brought joy to husband and wife, but one that brought strength to Sparta. In most Greek city-states, marriage was considered a private affair between families. In Sparta, however, the state stood firmly in the middle of every union, shaping it to serve its relentless military agenda. Marriage was not a contract of love or even property. It was an instrument of policy, tightly regulated to ensure the city's survival. The state dictated the timing of marriage. Men were forbidden to wed until they had completed years of military training and reached the age of 30. This ensured that only seasoned warriors proven in discipline and loyalty were entrusted with families. Women, by contrast, were married young, their fertility seen as a resource to be tapped early for the benefit of the city. Even this pairing of older men with younger women was less about custom than about strategy. It maximized the likelihood of strong offspring. Beyond timing, the state also intruded into fertility itself. If a marriage failed to produce children, it was not seen as a private misfortune, but as a public failure. The state could encourage unconventional arrangements, allowing another man to father children with a woman, or permitting an older husband to lend his wife to a younger warrior. To the Spartans, this was not shameful, but practical. The duty of every couple was to contribute to Sparta's population of warriors. Even the rituals of marriage bore the stamp of state ideology: the shaving of the bride's head, the ritual abduction, the secrecy of conjugal meetings. These customs reflected values of austerity, discipline, and restraint, all of which the state demanded from its citizens. Marriage was another form of training, not a sanctuary from it. The constant presence of the state also reinforced the paradox of Spartan life. While men were bound to the barracks, women were granted unusual authority at home. By forcing husbands to remain in military service long after marriage, the state created space for wives to manage estates and exercise influence. In this way, the state's grip on marriage indirectly elevated women's power, making them indispensable in both family and economic life. Ultimately, marriage in Sparta was not a personal milestone, but a civic obligation. Every shaved head, every secret meeting, Every child born under its system was proof that the state extended into the most intimate corners of life. In Sparta, even love and family bowed before the needs of war. The marriage customs of Sparta, so strange and severe to modern eyes, were never simply personal traditions. They were the direct reflection of a society built on discipline, austerity, and service to the state. Unlike Athens, where weddings were colorful celebrations filled with music and feasting, Spartan unions were marked by shaved heads, staged abductions, and secrecy. These practices stripped marriage of romance and luxury, turning it into a civic tool for producing strong citizens. The legacy of these customs lies in how completely they embodied Sparta's priorities. Every ritual, from the bride's transformation into a near masculine figure to the groom's nightly visits from the barracks, symbolized unity, strength, and subordination of the individual to the collective. Marriage was not about pleasure, but about function, designed to create a partnership that mirrored Sparta's military order, efficient, unyielding, and devoted to survival. Yet, paradoxically, this system elevated women in ways uncommon elsewhere in Greece. Because men remained bound to military service, women became managers of estates, property holders, and guardians of the household. Spartan wives were younger, but wielded remarkable influence, their voices sharp and their independence undeniable. While the state imposed harsh controls, it also gave women unusual prominence in civic life, a legacy that fascinated and unsettled other Greeks. These customs also reveal Sparta's uncompromising view of human relationships. Children were inspected for strength, marriages arranged for fertility, and even intimacy itself was subjected to the demands of the state. Love was secondary to duty, and beauty was shaved away in favor of resilience. What mattered was not the comfort of husband and wife, but the endurance of a society permanently at war. When Sparta eventually declined, its marriage rituals, like its military discipline, became the stuff of legend. Writers from other Greek cities often portrayed them as bizarre, even barbaric, yet also admirable in their stark dedication. Today, they serve as a reminder of how profoundly a culture's values can shape its most intimate institutions. The legacy of Spartan marriage customs is not romance, but revelation. They show us what happens when the state takes hold of family life, molding love and union into weapons of survival. In Sparta, even a wedding was a battlefield, a place where duty triumphed over desire, and the future of the city was forged in the private bonds of husband and wife.